Good evening. My name is Carol Bleathman Wright, and I will start with the background from my grandmother's side of the family, Mary Isabel Sanders. She was born in Guernsey in 1894 to my great-grandparents William Henry Sanders and Alice Maria Osier. The Sanders family then traveled to New Zealand, where a great-grandfather, I believe, was a baker. They then, sometime in the early 1900s, traveled to Victoria because one of my grandmother's brothers was born in 1901 in Auckland, New Zealand. They then, between 1894 and 1914, acquired 9 children, 2 of which died at young ages. And in Victoria, the family lived in a few different addresses: Rithett Street, 3217 Belleville, which they lived, I believe, from 1911 until after 1921, Blinkbonny Farm on East Saanich Road, and White Road. And how I gathered all these addresses: my aunt was born in 1919, and she was born in the Bellevue Street house. My grandmother went to her mother's house to give birth. My father was born on Bellevue Street, and then my aunt, born in 1924, was born at Blinkbonny. And then from Blinkbonny, they had a farm on White Road, which, until the mid-70s, still belonged to the Sanders family. Next, we'll move to the background of the Bleathman family, that of my grandfather, Ernest Albert Bleathman. He was born at County Gates, Bournemouth, England, in 1893. He had 1 sister and 2 brothers who remained in England. After a family discussion, he came directly to Victoria and celebrated his 18th birthday in Victoria in 1911. He spent his young manhood in the logging industry, ranging up the coast as far as Prince Rupert. In 1918, he married Mary Sanders. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Alice first in 1919, Ernest, my father, in 1921, Doris, my aunt, in 1924, and Alan was born in 1932. And Alan, the youngest, he died of lung cancer at 21 years of age. My father, Ernest William, was the 2nd child. Now, we'll go back to my grandfather again, Ernest Sr. He worked for private motor firms until 1927, and then for the next 15 years, he worked in the engineering department for the district of Saanich. Then, during the war years, he worked in the shipyards, mainly Yarrows. After the war ended, he went on his own. I have some letters from him to my father at the end of the war when they were arranging to purchase and build a gas station on the corner of West Saanich and East Saanich Roads. And we today know East Saanich Road at that corner as Viewmont. And now I'll just read you some interesting things from the letters. November 6th, 1945, and this is my grandfather writing to my father. I expect that you will be wondering how things are going out here and just what the situation is. I got through at Yarrows last Saturday, for the time being at least, as they have nothing on hand at present. As you have probably heard, I would like, if possible, to start in on my own account. I'm not getting younger. He was 55 years old. And think that it is now or never. Mother and I have looked over several possibilities, and 1 or 2 places are all out of reason. For example, that place of Guides at Langford. That used to be Jack Taylor's, a tumble-down building, 2 old-style pumps, and no stock or equipment to speak of for $4,200. The BA Oil Company, formerly Union Oil, have been after me for some time to run a place on the old Royal Oak Hotel site, which I don't know if most of you know, it burnt down. And I believe Peter has a story he told me one night out here in the parking lot of walking through the foundation and the rubble going to school. I don't want to do anything on a lease or rental agreement, as there is too much danger of being pushed out of the company's convenience. But I have made them a proposition, which, if accepted by them, will enable me to own the land and to pay for the buildings over a term of years. And I think there is a reasonable chance of the proposition being accepted. The chief difficulty that I have run into so far is obtaining a license from the Coal and Petroleum Products Control Board, without which it's impossible to go ahead. I had an interview with the chief clerk of the board today, and he told me that while I might get a license in any case, it would help my application considerably if I could show that it would reestablish an ex-serviceman. So, as far as I know, you have no definite plans following your discharge, so I'll try to put the situation to you as clearly as possible. And you and Dorothy, is my mother, must make your own decision. In the first place, I do not want financial help. Whatever help you get from the government, you will need to set up a home. My mom and dad had just gotten married at that time. You must also consider that a business has to be built up, and for the time at least, it will be poor pickings. Further, neither you nor I are very familiar with the latest tune-up on electrical work. We shall have to brush up considerably on that, and it may be that such a course would be available to you from the government as part of the reestablishment process. Perhaps the most difficult thing to be considered, though, is whether you and I could get along together. I don't say this in any unkindly manner, but perhaps if you think a little, you can see in the circle of your own acquaintances instances where a father and son, both decent fellows individually, just don't hit it off as well as they should. As to myself, and this is my grandfather, remember speaking, I know that I want things done my way and am impatient when they don't go right. And last night when my husband was reading this, he looked at me and he said, "And now I know where you get it." However, if you think it's worth a try, just say so. I think it will be an uphill fight to get things going, but given a couple of decent years and an even break, there should be a decent living on that corner for two men. It may be that at first one would have to take on a little outside work when available, but that shouldn't last long. And then it goes on to say, as to living quarters, we don't know just yet what we shall do. If I get a license, I shall look for a small place, even an old one for the time being, as close as possible to the job. Well, what happened is they sold their house on Lovett Avenue, and my aunt and uncle, Alice and Cam Wallace, were living on Quadra Street at the time, and they were living in a one-car garage with one child, and my grandmother and grandfather and my Aunt Doris, who was still at home, and my Uncle Alan, who was still at home, all lived in that one-car garage for a period of time. Very cramped quarters. So, this place could be easily sold at a good figure, but no use unless we have a place to go where we want it. So, this is what he'd written at that time, but I just gave you the story of what they actually did. And then they say, Mitchell's Place, formerly Elsie Taylor's, sold last week for $7,200. I have written out a letter which, if you think it worthwhile, I would like you to copy in your own handwriting, sign it, and send it back so that I can attach it to my application for a license. Do it as soon as you can, but take some time to think it over. I don't want to rope you into a situation you wouldn't care for, but of course, if we tried it and found it just wouldn't work, you could get out without any financial loss. I don't know of anything else to write just now. I've been busy for the past 2 days between the oil business and the selective service, but I'll have to hunt for something to keep me going until something definite occurs. There's not much going here now, And he was offered a job, but it was in Prince George, and he didn't want it. And then he says, Mother sends you news, and I'll say so long for now, your dad. So that was the first letter, and it was on November 6th of 45. And my dad was stationed in Halifax at the time. So the second letter, your letter of November 10th, arrived today. So evidently there's been rough weather across the continent, as that is more than slow for airmail. However, you did not need to hurry your reply, as I told you in my last letter that I have done all that can be done at this time. And now we can only wait and see what sort of reply the Eastern Office, and that's of the oil company, makes to the proposition, or what alternative they suggest. I have reason to be little optimistic on the score, as I can't say why here, but I'll tell you sometime when you're out here. So there was something going on that he wasn't going to put in a letter. After I have made an agreement with the company as to financing and the plans for the building, those plans have to be okayed by the Saanich municipality and then sent to Vancouver to get the license to build. I have been informed by Johnny Johnson that the restrictions on the buildings this type may be lifted by January 1st. So for whatever it was with the petroleum board and the gas station and the type of building, it all had to be approved in Vancouver, but they were hoping that by January 1st of 46 it would be lifted. A copy of the plans also has to be sent to the petroleum board with the application for the license, so that you can see that it will be some time before we can really start pumping. And Hugo Allen, who was one of the employees that my grandfather worked with at the District of Saanich, has been very good in drawing sketches, etc. for me, and has promised to see the blueprints and surveying if it should be required. I don't expect to meet any trouble from Saanich. In fact, some of the people out there would be glad to see the property in use. I attended a meeting last Tuesday when a number of the BA people were present, and I must say they made their business policies sound quite attractive. And why they wanted that building on that corner or something there is that's where the municipal hall was in Saanich at the time, across the street. Evidently, I did not make myself quite clear as to finances in my last letter. But I do want you and Dorothy to be quite satisfied that they don't want financial help. So my grandfather was quite concerned that he didn't want my dad's money from being discharged from the services. He wanted them to hang on to that for other things. You're going to need all that you have to get together to set up your own home, and that is the best use you can make of your money. I quite agree that building should be easier in a year or so, but in the meantime, hang on to what you have for that purpose. And then he says, the district around Royal Oak is building up rapidly. Now, in fact, there are over 40 places going up within a mile of it right now. And that would be down in where Dieppe is, where Diana's parents built their house. And the employment situation is poor just now. It will no doubt be better in the spring. So from that point of view, there is little to be gained by getting a quick discharge from the Navy, though I can quite see that you would be better off in several ways on this coast, because he was stuck in Halifax. And then there's a little bit about mother and family stuff. And then, we're still in the end of 1945, December 13th, 45. I guess you know just the place I'm after. It's the corner lot on the northwest corner of the junction of East and West Saanich Roads. It runs 126 feet up the East Road from the corner that is up to the post office. So the post office must have been in where the hairdresser, which in one of those pictures in the back is the Bank of Montreal, and it was Royal Oak Cablevision for a while and all sorts of different things over the years. And 244 feet on the West Road up to the schoolyard. The lot is almost exactly 3/4 of an acre. Of course, we shall only need a small part of the place for the business, but we intend to build on part of it what will be, according to our present plans, a duplicate of this place, and this place was their house on Lovett Avenue. That we shall have to do as early as possible, as from every point of view, the sooner we get settled in the place, the better. Mick Doherty has told me that some buildings in Pat Bay, out at the airport, will be for sale about February and has promised to do whatever he can to get me what I need. I hope that he will be successful, as it means a whole lot these days to get lumber and fittings you need. They would have been taken down and trucked in, but at a price it would be worth the while. By the way, some of the boys on the ships here tell me that they have been able to get hold of good socket sets and also 12-point sets, and you carmen know all that lingo, whatever it is, so that if you should have any opportunities of that sort, don't pass it up. And those were the 3 letters that Mom had kept in all the stuff that showed what the conversation was. And that was in the end of 1945. Then I have my grandfather's little black book. In it, he has written down every penny that was spent on the building, wages, equipment, and everything. And the total for the gas station in 1946 was $71.48.42. And in here we have, wherever Enid went, her brother-in-law, Frank Bull. We have Diana's uncle. We have D.A. Little. And then we have all the electrical places. My Uncle Cam for doing some of the wiring. And all the money that was spent. And in the next part, he's done the same thing when they built the house, which was on the other half of the property and just slightly behind the gas station, which is now, I believe, Oak something Corners. When they were, what is it? Shady Oak. When they had a contest and it was asked that people send in suggestions as to what to call that corner, Doug Crosby sent in that he wanted it as Bleathman Corners, but it ended up being Shady Oak. But that is the little group of veterinarian and fish and chip shop and little store that's in there now. And in this book, the Little Black Book, which it is, Little Black Book, is all the wages that he paid to the employees for the first little while, which were just my father and a couple of part-time people that were in the service with my father that he had come in and help on occasion. And in the very back, it's actually got the stamp where it was approved by EI. So this actual book got sent in for the approval for the EI contributions for the employees, which I thought was quite interesting. My grandmother and grandfather lived in the house behind, and I would go to school at Royal Oak. My dad would work, drive me to my grandmother's house. He would go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then I would walk from there down to the Royal Oak Elementary School. And we were the first class in the brand new grade 1 Royal Oak School. And there was Diana and Margaret and I, and we're still here today. And Margaret's off somewhere in the sun. And then he retired 10 years later at 65. In 1958, they retired, they went on a rural cruise. They sold the house to Doug Crosby, the druggist that was in Royal Oak Shopping Center, and his family lived in the house. And the Gulf Oil purchased the gas station portion of the property, and it was subdivided off. And then my father started leasing it from the Gulf, or BA Oil at the time, on the 15th of August of 1958. And now, and also the building, we had all the discussions in 1945 at the end of the year about buying the property and getting all this stuff going. And November 1946, they were pumping gas and open for business. Less than 1 year later. Now, we'll get into my mom and dad. My mother, Dorothy Graham, who was a longtime Victoria resident, and my grandparents and great-grandparents on the Graham side were so, and my father were married in July 1945. And once the gas station had opened, they could see their way, with my dad's money from the VLA, to purchase a 10-acre farm on Linnet Lane. They had only been there a short time when some well-meaning friend, in all good nature, donated them some bantams. Well, from there, more livestock. A cow for milk, more chickens, pigs for that much-loved ham we like. And during the 1950s, my father continued to work at the gas station, modern service. And my parents raised chickens from day-old layers until about 5 months old when they sold them to the egg farms, all the way up to Port Alberni and through Lower Vancouver Island. We had a few turkeys in the early 50s, and by 1962, we were up to 500 plus. December we dreaded. Every December, every turkey must be slaughtered, feathered, pin feathered, cleaned, and on the 23rd of December there was trucks, panel trucks, delivering turkeys door to door to people that had ordered 500 turkeys for Christmas dinner. Then in 1962, that was the last load of the last load of turkeys. We had built a new house on the property on Linnet Lane. We were still living in the old house, and on the 22nd of December, all 500 turkeys were laying out in the basement because it was nice and cold, waiting to be loaded in trucks and delivered. The turkeys got in the new house before we did. Then, that was the end of the turkeys, but the chickens were still going strong. And the chickens had taken over, and there was thousands at a time. We keep them till 5 months old, and then off they go. And at the time of my father's death in 1970, we had over 50,000 chickens on the property the day he died. Now we're going to revert back to 1958. In 1958, my grandfather, Ernest Sr., decided to retire and sold the building to Gulf Oil. My father leased the building back. Continued the gas station and the vehicle repair business. At this time, my parents were feeling the pinch. There was only my dad and one employee, Dick Varley. So when a car needed to be picked up or delivered to a customer, my mother would pitch in. She was already doing the books for the gas station and looking after multitudes of animals on the farm. In addition, there were times when money was short, and whether the farm was paying the bills for the gas station or the gas station was paying the bills for the farm, who knows at this point. Times got better, and in the late 50s and early 60s, other employees were hired, not all at the same time, but Bob Lindsay came to work with Dick Varley and my dad, and then he went off to work for National Motors, or one of those car companies selling trucks and cars. And then Bob Cuthbert, Enid's brother, worked there for a good long time and took his apprenticeship. And then Ken Dorman, who was in the Navy in the 50s, he came when he was off to help out. And that's just to name a few. During the 60s, Dad hired some of the local boys around the neighborhood and from school to pump gas. There were quite a few, and I can only remember some of them, so I'm not even going to try and remember names. I might remember one and not the other. Also, sometime during the 60s, BA was bought out and became Gulf Oil, and now, of course, it's Petrochem. In 1970, my father died suddenly, and that was the end of the chickens, the gas station, and everything else. Mom went back to work in an office, and the farm had to get rid of all the animals. And then, as I said earlier, my father was the only son to marry and leave children to carry on the Bleathman name. As I, a daughter, am an only child, the Bleathman name in Canada has come to an end with me. To ensure the continuation of the Bleathman name in Saanich, as my father and I have lived in Saanich all our lives, in the early 1970s, my husband and I officially registered and named the creek that passes from Maltby Lake through the southern portion of our property on Prospect Lake Road and drains into Prospect Lake as Bleathman Creek. And that concludes my background of the Bleathman family and the modern service station in Royal Oak. And I also have heard over the years some of your stories of my grandfather's and father's local garage. Bob Cuthbert, one day we get this phone call when he was working. He's been sent to the hospital. Don't ask me what he was working on. The automotive people will know that. But he had been badly burned. And there was times when Dick Varley had Grant King's race car in the shop, and my dad said it wasn't for working on race cars. Dick could work on it, but he didn't want the whole pit crew in there. This was an operation for business. There was equipment. There was all sorts of things in there. So Dick could work on it, but not the crew. And we've had various different little stories come back. And there was a lady that lived at what is now the end of Wilkinson Road, and where Royal Oak Drive and the West Saanich Road intersection is. She lived there, and I believe her name was Mrs. Hobbs, and she's long since gone. And my husband met my father. There was this car that came down Reynolds Road, and how it happened, it went skating through the holly trees and landed in the middle of the holly field on Reynolds Road. And my dad came to check the car out, and the brakes failed. And that's how my husband met my father. So that's it. Any questions?
And it would scare my kids going, because we lived on Quadra Street.
Yeah.
And he was more worried about my kids than what was happening to him. And I don't remember how badly he was burnt or...
All I remember is I was bawling my eyes out, and we went roaring up to the hospital. And I was a teenager at that time, and Bob was my idol at some points, and he'd got burnt. And so he was all bandaged up, but I don't know whether it was both arms or just one arm, but something had happened and got fire, and it was down in the back of the shop. So my dad was quite concerned, and we all went roaring up to the hospital behind the ambulance.
Gas, and your grandfather's gas station got the work for the police cars, I believe, or was it the other way around?
I don't know. I know we did work on the police cars. Yeah. Well, I know in the late 50s, early 60s, the Women's Institute, we got one of those great big rolling pop machines where you slide the bottles through and then pull them out the end. And it was my job, any profit that was made from the pop machine, I could have for the profit. And so every night after school, I'd go and fill the pop machine, and then on certain nights, the people in the Women's Institute, I'd push this thing all the way across the street in the traffic into the Women's Institute, and then take cases of pop in and load it right to the gunnels, because they'd have square dances and things going on in the Women's Institute. And so for a long time, I was going to Royal Oak, and then I'd go up after school and fill the pop machine and then push it across the street in the traffic. And then it wasn't too bad going into the Women's Institute, but coming back out, it was up a hill. And then the odd time we'd forget to put it in at night, and some local, whatever you'd like to call them, would come along and unplug it and move it down the street, or you'd find it where it didn't belong if we forgot to put it in at night. But and then I was in the 50s when my dad first took over. We had to do a big stock taking, and I was 12, and I can remember sitting there counting spark plugs till the cows came home. I don't know how many, but they were $1 each. I know that at the point. Every spark plug was $1 each. No, it wasn't till years later that I found out that my husband and my father met that day when Mrs. Hobbs' car was sitting in the middle of the holly trees on Reynolds Road. He says there was nothing wrong with those brakes. She hit the gas pedal, not the brake. But my dad said, "Oh no, I think the brakes failed." Off went the car and the record of the station and get checked out. Yeah. And my dad's older sister Alice, who married Cam Wallace, Cam built their house, which is now the end of Chatterton Way. They expropriated the house to put Chatterton Way through.
The big tree's still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The tree's still there.
Yeah.
But yeah. And in this little black book, I'm just looking here, they've got wages and insurance, Corporation of Saanich, building license, $5.50. D.A. Little, he must have been one of the workers because they've got July 8th to July 20th. Rithett Construction Limited Insurance. D.A. Little. BC Electric for the power, $2. And my dad got paid $6 for a week. Yeah. And Cam Wallace got $39.20 for some of the electrical work. Cunningham Drug for the first aid kit, $2.16. The water bill, $1.75 for the month of August. And then we have Frank Bull for September 9th to the 20th, got $9. There's some interesting little things in here of, just the different places they bought things. And just to add a little bit, the stories I've heard, when the station was taken down and Petrocan built the station that's currently there, Harvey Sherman has the hoist that my grandfathers had bought from Pat Bay and brought in and put in. So it's still around. Whether it's still laying or whether it's actually installed somewhere.
That lived there throughout their lives. So how would your aunt be?
I just know that they at one point lived on, the Sanders family lived on Blinkbonny Farm. Now whether they were working there or whether they actually owned it, I don't know. Maybe Vicky can find out through the Sanders half of the family. But I do know my Auntie Doris was born in 1924 on Blinkbonny Farm.
So I understand my husband.
Yeah, because in 1921 they were on Bellevue. And I believe from 1911 till at least 1921 when my dad was born, they were on Bellevue. And then they went to Blinkbonny for a very short time. And then they bought the farm on White Road. And it was 10 acres. And then, of course, my grandfather died, or my great-grandfather died.
That's the
And
road out there.
White Road, that's part of Seabrook, and
Yes, right.
like it actually goes to Seabrook and then White Road and then down onto East Saanich. And VNS.
And that is part of White Road in behind the fairgrounds again.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, they were on the part that actually looks down over Wallace Drive where the veterinarian there is on the corner of Stellies and that looked over there. And they were there well into the 70s. My uncle, well, he's my great uncle Frank. And he was still living there until he became too ill to live there, and then he went to Glendale. And then he passed away in the 70s, and he was the last one. But after my grandfather died, and they quit farming it, like my Uncle Frank had the loganberries and strawberries, and my dad, we had pigs and cows and things. Well, I can remember we had one pig, she chewed her way out of anything you put her into. We built like a 4x4 wall, solid wood, and she'd eat her way out of it. So my Uncle Frank, great Uncle Frank actually, he said he'd take her. So we bundled her in the truck and took her out there, and much to his astonishment, she was about to give birth, and the neighbor phoned and said, "Would you like to get your pig and all her baby pigs out of my basement?" Because she'd eaten her way out of the pig pen. And my great-grandmother, when her later years, she went to live in the house behind the gas station with my grandmother and grandfather in her last years. And then she was living there when she died in 1952. But Uncle Frank remained on the property until he couldn't look after it anymore. And then when he died, Vicky's father-in-law, my great-uncle Bill, sold it when he'd cleaned up the estate.
And I have their own.
Yes, and quite a few of Uncle Frank's implements that were on the farm ended out at the Saanich Artifacts on the Pat Bay Highway there. And actually, one of the Sanders descendants was the second born child of my great-grandmother and grandfather. She died in 1922, 6 months after she'd given birth to twins. Both her and her husband had TB, and they gave birth to the twins. And my great-grandmother, who was grandmother to the twins, adopted them rather than see them go to an orphanage. And so she raised the twins as well as the rest of her kids. So she actually had 9 of her own, 2 of which she lost at young ages, and then she adopted the twins and raised them. And then the last twin just died on Christmas Day last year, and her family did a little story that Alice May had told all of us of her quitting school and working on the farm and doing the berries and all of that stuff after my great-grandfather died, because she had to stay home and help Grandma with the farm, and that was on White Road. So, and they actually just live behind us here on Falaise Drive. As you're coming in and you make your left to come here, you turn right and they're the second house up. So they've been in the neighborhood in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and till they're still there. So it's a small world when you hook it all together. And I can add for Vicky that my Uncle Bill, her father-in-law, who was my grandmother's brother, has continued on, and Vicky's son has a son. So the Sanders family will continue, but a lot of them didn't have any children or had girls, so of course the names changed, and like the Bleathmans, the name is gone. And there is lots of Bleathmans still left in Basingstoke outside of London. But as far as Canada's concerned, there's none. I was the last Bleathman born in Canada that we're aware of. And
My grandson is 11 years old. He's a son.
And it was quite interesting. In 1975, I received a letter in the mail from London, and a lady, and I couldn't tell you her name right now, had passed away. And they were trying to find all her relatives. Well, all of her family, brothers, sisters, etc., had had no children. So, of course, when you die without a will, they go back up. And so they went back to my great-great-great-grandmother, who had married a Bleathman. And then they came all the way back down. And because my father died, I received part of the inheritance. And I got 41 pounds. And my uncle, my grandfather's brother, which is my great-uncle Reggie, he had numerous children, and he was in his 80s, and they had very little money. And he used to be Santa at Christmas to earn money to buy Christmas presents and have a Christmas dinner. And I just said, he can have the 49 pounds. And so I signed it all off, and I got the most glorious letter from Uncle Reggie, because that just meant the world to him. He didn't have to go and be Santa at the store that year for Christmas, because that money just made the difference for him. Which was quite moving, because I was reading the letter again today when I was digging out things. And he, of course, now is long gone, but anyway, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.